The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. 41-year-old Seo Ji-hwan raised his crystal glass and smiled at the 12 faces gathered around his table, trusted men, wealthy partners, old friends. He had ordered everything, the aged wagyu, the imported wine, the chef flown in from Los Angeles. He had even ordered his wife. Amara sat at the far end of the table, composed, beautiful, silent. Then Ji-hwan pointed at her. You know what I love most about my wife? He wasn't asking her. He was performing for the room. She knows exactly what she is without me. Nothing. The laughter came fast and easy. Amara's fingers pressed flat against the white linen tablecloth. She smiled. She had smiled through 8 years of this. 8 years of being the punchline in her own home. If you've ever sat in a room where someone you loved made you smaller, and you smiled anyway because the alternative was worse, stay with me. This story is for you. Welcome, and if you're new here, subscribe now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Amara's story travels. Now, let's go back to that dinner table, because what happened next changed everything. The night began the way most disasters do, without any particular warning. Ji-hwan had announced the dinner 2 days earlier, which meant Amara had 2 days to confirm with the caterers, arrange the flowers, approve the menu, coordinate with the house staff, and prepare herself to spend an evening being decorative. She was good at all of it. She had learned to be. She dressed carefully, a deep burgundy sheath dress understated jewelry, heels that added 3 inches, without making her taller than Ji-hwan in photographs. She knew which details he noticed and which ones he weaponized if she got them wrong. The dress was his preference. The understated jewelry was her one quiet refusal to disappear entirely. By 7 o'clock, the guests had arrived. 12 men, 4 of their wives, and 1 woman who was introduced only as a business associate from Vancouver. The men were loud in the way that wealthy men become when they feel entirely safe, expansive, careless, occasionally crass. Ji-hwan was the loudest. He was always the loudest in rooms he owned. Amara moved through the evening the way water moves around stones. She greeted people warmly. She remembered names and connected them to previous conversations. This man's daughter had just started at Stanford. That man's mother had been ill. The business associate from Vancouver preferred white wine and had a particular distaste for anything too sweet. People found her easy to talk to. They always did. Ji-hwan noticed. He noticed the way the Vancouver woman laughed at something, Amara said. He noticed the way one of his senior associates leaned forward when she spoke about a shipping route delay that had been in the news. He noticed and something tightened in his expression, the way it always did when Amara attracted attention he hadn't allocated to her. We're 8 years into the marriage. She still hadn't learned to make herself invisible enough for his comfort. The food came and went. The wine was replaced twice. Conversation moved from business to gossip to the kind of political commentary wealthy men enjoy because it costs them nothing. Then Ji-hwan refilled his glass for the 4th time and leaned back in his chair. I want to propose a toast, he announced. The table quieted. He raised his glass toward Amara with the particular smile she had come to understand was not warmth but performance. To my wife who has never had to worry about a single thing in her entire life. He paused, letting the sentiment hang pleasantly in the air. Because I worried for her. Polite laughter. Appreciative murmurs. Someone said he was a good husband. Amara raised her own glass and smiled. You know, Ji-hwan continued, warming to the audience the way he always did, she had nothing before me. I mean nothing. No real career, no real direction. I built everything she has. He gestured around the room, the art on the walls, the view of the water beyond the glass. And you know what? She's good at enjoying it. More laughter. Louder this time. Amara held her smile in place. She was skilled at this. She had been practicing for 8 years. Tell them what you do, Habiba. He used the Arabic endearment deliberately he always did in company, as if the word made him cosmopolitan rather than condescending. Tell them about your little business thing. I have a consulting firm, Amara said. Her voice came out level, steady, uninflected. She calls it a consulting firm. Ji-hwan smiled at the room. I call it an expensive hobby that keeps her busy while I actually make the money. The Vancouver woman's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The man with the daughter at Stanford looked briefly uncomfortable before deciding to find his wine glass very interesting. Amara said nothing. Ji-hwan kept going. That was the thing about him when he drank, not that he became cruel, but that he stopped editing the cruelty he already carried. He began describing her as a project, something he'd improved. He joked about the apartment she'd lived in before they married, about the car she'd driven, about the conference she'd attended that he'd funded before they became serious. Every sentence was technically a fact. Every sentence was also a demolition. Amara set her fork down. She wasn't angry yet. Anger came later privately, usually at 3 in the morning over a laptop in a study he never visited. What she felt right now was something more precise, the cold, quiet weight of a decision that had been building for years, finally reaching its full mass. She recognized the feeling. She had felt it before. The first time Ji-hwan told a business associate that she had a good instinct for interiors when Amara had just spent 45 minutes explaining logistics optimization. The time he'd told a journalist, standing directly beside her, that he handled all the business decisions, naturally. Splitting. The time he'd taken a phone call in the middle of a conversation she'd been having with his attorney, and the attorney had simply pivoted to Ji-hwan without acknowledging the interruption. 8 years of small removals, each one forgiven, each one stored. Ji-hwan set his glass down with the deliberate care of a man who knows he's had enough wine, but is choosing not to acknowledge it. You know what would happen if I left her tomorrow? He asked the room. Not her. Silence. Real silence this time. Not the comfortable pauses between wealthy people. The kind of silence that arrives when a room realizes it has been pulled into something it would prefer not to witness. She'd be back within the week. He was smiling, but his eyes had gone flat. Begging. The word landed exactly the way he intended it to. Amara looked at him across the length of the table. For a moment, just a moment, she let him see her clearly. Not the smile, not the performance, not the woman who had learned to minimize herself into a shape that fit comfortably beside his ego. Just her. Ji-hwan's smile flickered. Maybe he felt it. Maybe some part of him, buried beneath 8 years of unchallenged certainty, registered that something had shifted in the specific gravity of the room. Then Shushu's, his voice had gone cold. He wasn't performing now. He was genuinely angry, and underneath the anger was something he would never have identified as fear. If you think you're so capable, so independent, so much better than this. He gestured at the table, the room, the life he'd decided she owed him gratitude for. Then beg me to keep you, or walk out. 12 people stopped breathing. Amara rose from her chair. She excused herself from the table in a voice so calm it was almost frightening. She thanked the guests for the evening. She walked across the room without hurrying. The study was at the end of the east corridor. She had been keeping the documents there for 3 months. She knew what was in the overnight bag behind the cabinet. She had packed it herself, then repacked it twice to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything important. She took 20 minutes. When she returned to the dining room, she was carrying 2 suitcases and a flat document folder. She set the folder on the table in front of Ji-hwan. Inside was a divorce filing, properly prepared, already signed on her line. Ji-hwan looked at the folder. He looked at the suitcases. He looked at his wife's face. For the first time in 8 years, Seo Ji-hwan had nothing to say. Amara picked up her coat from the chair by the entrance. She turned to the room, met a few of the shocked faces calmly, and said, "Thank you for coming." Then she walked out. The night air hit her like cold water, sharp, real, clarifying. Her car was in the garage. The address she had programmed into the navigation 8 months ago was still saved under the name she'd given it, home. She drove across Seattle in the dark, and she didn't cry. She had expected to. She had rehearsed that part of the night many times, the breaking down somewhere private, the release of everything she'd held contained. But as the city lights moved past the windows, what she felt instead was something quieter. Something that felt, unexpectedly, like peace. The apartment building rose against the waterfront skies, with its glass face catching the last of the evening light. She had chosen it because the building's orientation meant her windows faced east. She liked mornings. She had spent years giving her best hours to other people's schedules. The doorman recognized her. She had made sure to visit enough times over the past month that her face was familiar to the night staff. These things mattered. She had thought about all of it. Her key worked. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it 3 weeks earlier when she'd made her last quiet visit to update the pantry and check that everything was in order. Her clothes were in the closet. Her laptop was on the desk. The filing cabinet in the second room held copies of every relevant financial document, organized by date and category. Amara set her suitcases inside the door. She stood in the center of the living room. Then she sat down on the couch, took off her heels, and pressed her hands flat against her knees the same way she'd pressed them flat against the tablecloth 2 hours earlier. The difference was that this time no one was watching. She sat with it, the enormity of what had just happened. Not doubt. She wasn't going to revisit the decision. That question had been answered too many times. In too many 3 in the morning spreadsheets and quietly negotiated contracts and insurance filings under a business name Ji-hwan had never looked closely enough to register. What she sat with was something more like grief. Not for the marriage, exactly. The marriage had been over for longer than tonight. But for the specific illusion she had believed when she first met him that someone like Ji-hwan could see her, really see her, and still choose her. That illusion had taken years to die. It had died slowly, one dinner party joke at a time. She allowed herself 10 minutes. Then she opened her laptop. There were 17 emails waiting, 2 from clients, 1 from her financial advisor, several from colleagues. The business had not stopped while she attended a dinner party that ended in the demolition of her marriage. She appreciated that about the business. It was hers. Entirely hers. It did not pause for his drinking or his need to perform his own importance at her expense. Amara worked until 2 in the morning. She slept for 6 hours. When she woke, there was one message from Ji-hwan. He had sent it at 1:47 a.m. Stop embarrassing yourself. Come home. She read it once, set her phone face down on the nightstand, made coffee, stood in front of her east-facing windows, and watched the first light come over the water. It was the first morning in 8 years that had felt entirely like hers. Back across the city, Ji-hwan had not slept. After Amara left, the dinner had dissolved within 20 minutes. His associates filed out with the careful efficiency of men who understood that the worst thing they could do was acknowledge what they'd witnessed. The Vancouver woman said good night to no one in particular. The man with the daughter at Stanford patted Ji-hwan once on the shoulder, a gesture that managed to communicate both sympathy and the distinct wish to be elsewhere. Then Ji-hwan was alone in the dining room. The food was still on the table. He sat in his chair for a long time. His first instinct, the one that arrived within seconds and stayed, was that she would come back. He was certain of this, the way he was certain of his own name. Amara had been with him for 8 years. She did not have a backup plan. She was not the kind of woman who had backup plans. He was wrong about this, in a way he couldn't yet understand. By midnight, he had called her twice. She didn't answer. By 1 in the morning, he had sent the message. By 3, he was in his own study reviewing her name against the household financial accounts, confirming that all of their joint assets remained where he expected them to be. They did. That, more than anything, reassured him. She wasn't gone. She was making a point. He would give her 3 days to make the point, and then he would have his attorney reach out, and they would have a conversation like adults, and she would return, and life would resume. Ji-hwan had a talent for deciding how situations would resolve themselves. It was one of the qualities that had made him dangerous inside the Korean underworld networks he'd inherited and expanded over 15 years. People who encountered that certainty either fell in line or made the mistake of underestimating what happened to people who didn't. He assumed Amara would fall in line. He had always assumed this. He went to bed at 4 in the morning and slept until noon. When he woke, there were no calls from her, no texts. Just his message unanswered, sitting at the top of his phone screen. He called her again at 12:15. Her voicemail picked up on the first ring. She had sent his call directly. Ji-hwan sat up in bed with his phone in his hand. He was not a man who responded well to being sent to voicemail. He called his attorney. 3 weeks later, Amara sat across from her own attorney in the bright conference room of a downtown legal office, reviewing the status of the divorce filing. Ji-hwan had not signed. She had expected this. He's stalling, her attorney said. Common. He may be hoping you'll negotiate, or he may simply be unwilling to accept the process moving forward. Then let it move forward without his acceptance. Amara straightened a corner of the document in front of her. What's the timeline? Her attorney walked her through it. Amara listened with the focused attention she had learned to cultivate in the years when she'd had to absorb complex information in small windows of privacy during car rides between his events, in bathroom breaks at his dinners, in the 20-minute gaps between his phone calls when she sat in her study and built something he was too certain of himself to ever investigate. She took notes. She asked 3 specific questions. She thanked her attorney and left. On the street outside the building, her phone rang. The name on the screen was Seo Ji-hwan's most senior lieutenant, a man she had known for 6 years. He was meticulous, ruthlessly loyal, and one of the few people in Ji-hwan's world who had occasionally looked at Amara as though she were a person rather than a feature of Ji-hwan's life. She answered, Amara. His voice was careful. How are you? Well, she said. Thank you for asking. A pause. He's not doing well. She already knew this. She had been receiving information through the quiet network of professional contacts she'd accumulated over years, not deliberately assembled as a surveillance apparatus, but simply the natural result of being competent and consistent in a world where most people were neither. People talked to her. They had always talked to her. Ji-hwan had interpreted this as her performing a social function on his behalf. He hadn't understood that she was building relationships for herself. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. And she meant it, partially. She was not a woman who enjoyed watching anything collapse. He thinks you're talking to people, Da-sung said carefully. Competitors. Or another pause. Others was the word they used for the federal investigators who had circled Ji-hwan's organization for 2 years without finding the precise leverage they needed. I'm not talking to anyone, Amara said. I believe you. Da-sung sounded tired. I wanted you to know because he's going to push. He doesn't handle. He stopped. Chose the words with care. He doesn't handle uncertainty well. I know. Take care of yourself. The call ended. Amara put her phone in her bag and walked to where her car was parked. In the trunk was a portfolio case containing printed copies of 3 new contracts she'd signed in the past 2 weeks. Corporate clients. Significant accounts. The kind of work that would have been impossible to pursue openly while she'd been managing the logistics of being Ji-hwan's wife at the same time. She had not contacted his competitors. She had not leaked information. She had not made a single call intended to damage his business. She hadn't needed to. Ji-hwan was doing that himself. The first sign had come before Amara even left the house. For months prior to the dinner, she had watched Ji-hwan make decisions that she would never have made and that his most experienced advisors had quietly recommended against. He had forced through a contract renegotiation that insulted a partner he'd worked with for 9 years. He'd overridden a risk assessment on a new shipping corridor that his operations manager had flagged 3 times. He had demanded accelerated timelines from employees who were already stretched, and when those timelines weren't met, he had attributed the failure to disloyalty rather than mathematics. She had tried once to say something. They were in the kitchen. A Saturday morning, which was the only time Ji-hwan was occasionally reachable in the way that other people are reachable, slightly less armored, slightly more willing to actually hear a sentence to its end. She had brought up the partner negotiation, but framed it carefully. Explained her concern without suggesting he was wrong that was a rule she had learned early, that the framing mattered as much as the substance. He had listened for approximately 45 seconds. Then he had refilled his coffee, smiled at her, and said, "Stick to your spreadsheets, Habiba." She had not tried again. Now, 3 weeks into the separation, his operations manager had resigned. The insulted partner had moved 2 major contracts to a competitor. Two junior members of his logistics team had quietly started job searching. The sound and this information had reached Amara through a woman she'd hired for her own company 6 months earlier, who had previously worked adjacent to Ji-hwan's legitimate operations. The ripples were spreading. Amara sat in her office, in her apartment, in the building she had chosen and leased and furnished herself, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Sorrow, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the particular sorrow of watching something that didn't need to failing. She had genuinely believed, in the early years, that Ji-hwan was more than his worst qualities. She had seen, in the beginning, a man who was brilliant and driven and capable of a kind of focused attention that made her feel, briefly, like the most significant person in any room. She had loved that man. She had tried for a long time to wait for him to come back. He had only ever moved further away from her, into the version of himself that required an audience to feel real. Amara closed the folder on her desk. She had 3 calls in the next 2 hours, a new client in Denver, a check-in with her financial advisor, and a debrief with the project manager she'd hired to handle logistics for the firm's expanded capacity. She opened her calendar. She began. Outside, Seattle moved through its ordinary Tuesday. In ignorance of the divorce being processed across its legal offices, the empire quietly unraveling across its commercial districts, and the woman in the east-facing apartment doing exactly what she had always done. Working, building, becoming. Amara's first full week alone passed the way she had expected it to, with the specific, grinding busyness of a woman who had a great deal to do, and, for the first time, all the space in the world to do it. She was up at 6:30 every morning. Not 3 in the morning, not the stolen hours she used to carve out of his sleeping schedule to tend to a business he'd decided wasn't real. 6:30. Coffee, the view over the water, a run along the waterfront when the weather allowed. Then her desk, her laptop, her calendar, and the work that had been waiting years for her to give it her full attention. She did not think about Ji-hwan between the hours of 6:30 and 10 at night. She had decided this the same way she decided most things practically, without drama. Thinking about him was not productive. What had been said at the dinner table had been said. What had been filed with the court had been filed. The rest was process, and process did not require her emotional participation to continue forward. Her attorney called on Thursday of that first week. He's asked for a 60-day extension, the attorney said. Procedural grounds. It's thin, but judges often accommodate first requests. Grant it, Amara said. A pause. You're sure? I'm sure. She was watching a container ship move slowly through the gray morning water. 60 days doesn't change anything on my end. Let him feel like he has time. What she didn't say, because it wasn't her attorney's business, was that 60 days was also 60 more days of Veyne Meridian Advisory operating without the weight of Ji-hwan's shadow across its client list. 60 more days of people in Seattle's professional community learning that Amara Veyne existed separately from the man they'd always associated her with. Time, in her experience, was rarely neutral. It was working for someone or against someone. Right now it was working for her. Ji-hwan found out about the extension request through his own attorney. He had expected relief when the request was granted. What he felt instead was a specific frustration. He couldn't entirely name the sense that he was managing a situation that should not have required management. Amara was supposed to have called by now. Mutual friends were supposed to have relayed messages. Some signal was supposed to have arrived, indicating that the point had been made, the lesson acknowledged, and normal life was ready to resume. Nothing had arrived. He was in his office on the 42nd floor of the Huryun Pacific building, when his deputy director of operations, a man named Park Sung-min, knocked and entered without waiting for a response. Ji-hwan looked up. Park Sung-min was 54, had worked for him for 11 years, and was one of the few people in the organization who did not visibly flinch when Ji-hwan was in a difficult mood. This had always been one of his more useful qualities. "We have a problem," Park said. "We have many problems." "Which one?" Park set a folder on the desk. "Meridian Freight. They've called 2 contacts this week, asking about alternatives to our northern corridor. They're not being subtle." Ji-hwan opened the folder. "What did our contacts say?" "What do you think they said?" "They called me." Ji-hwan looked through the documents. Meridian Freight was not their largest client, but it was consistent, the kind of steady account that other clients noticed when it moved. If Meridian left, others would ask questions. Call Choi, Ji-hwan said. Choi was his senior relationship manager for commercial accounts. Tell him to invite them to dinner this week. Choi resigned on Monday. Park's voice was completely flat. Ji-hwan looked up from the folder. I mentioned it in the Tuesday briefing, Park said. You were on a call. A silence opened between them. Why did he resign? Ji-hwan's voice had gone quiet, in the way it went quiet before something became very loud. Park held his gaze without blinking. He said he'd received a better offer. From where, he didn't specify. His resignation was clean. Ji-hwan set the folder down. Was it? Yes. The word landed with enough precision that Ji-hwan understood. Park was telling him to be careful about what he implied next. Choi had been with them for 7 years. He was not a man who invited scrutiny. Arrange the Meridian dinner yourself, Ji-hwan said. I have 3 other fires that are more immediate. Then put them out faster. Ji-hwan turned back to his desk. That's what I pay you for. Park picked up the folder. He was halfway to the door when Ji-hwan spoke again. Has she contacted anyone here? Park stopped. My wife. Ji-hwan's voice didn't change. Has she been in contact with anyone in this building? Park turned around slowly. Not that I've been told. If she has, Ji-hwan said, I want to know. Park looked at him for a moment, the particular look of a man measuring exactly how much truth the other person can hold. She hasn't contacted anyone here, Park said. Whatever is happening with Meridian, whatever happened with Choi that's not her. Then what is it? Park paused at the door. It's consequences, he said. And then he left. Ji-hwan sat alone in his office for a long time after that. He didn't like the word consequences when it was applied to his own behavior. A sound like green wood splitting. He had spent 15 years in a world that operated on the understanding that consequences were something that happened to other people, people who made mistakes, who showed weakness, who failed to project the kind of authority that made others think twice. He had projected that authority. He had never shown weakness. Except his mind moved briefly to the dinner, to the faces around the table, to Amara rising without hurrying, 2 suitcases and a folder. Her voice so controlled it had felt more like a verdict than a departure. He pushed the thought away. She would call. She didn't call. What she did, 3 weeks into the separation, was appear at a logistics industry networking event at a downtown hotel, not as anyone's wife, not as a guest of someone else's company, but as Veyne Meridian Advisory, with her name on the attendee list and business cards that said founder and managing director. Amara had attended industry events before. Ji-hwan's events, galas and dinners and charity functions, where she had circulated and been pleasant and represented his household with the grace he expected. She knew how to work a room. What she had never done was work a room for herself. It was different. The first conversation she had with a supply chain director from a mid-size pharmaceutical company lasted 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she tracked her time at events the same way she tracked everything. The director's name was Karen Hollis, and she had been having a problem with their third-party logistics provider for 6 months. A sound like Green Woods Amara, of talking to Amara, she was describing the problem in detail because something about Amara's questions made the problem feel like it had a solvable shape. It did have a solvable shape. Amara recognized it within the first 90 seconds. By the time Karen Hollis took Amara's card, she was already holding it with both hands, the unconscious physical tell of someone who intends to actually use it. Amara moved to the next conversation. By the end of the evening, she had spoken to 22 people and collected 9 cards from individuals who had initiated further contact within the week. She drove home along the waterfront. At a red light, she looked at herself in the rearview mirror. She looked tired. The past 3 weeks had required a specific kind of energy, the energy of maintaining composure under sustained pressure, of managing legal processes while simultaneously growing a business, of sleeping 6 hours a night and making it sufficient. The tiredness was real and she acknowledged it. But underneath the tiredness was something she could only describe as appetite. She wanted more. More clients, more contracts, more conversations where her expertise was the thing that mattered, rather than her position relative to a powerful man. The light changed. She drove home. She was already thinking about Karen Hollis's third-party logistics problem and the 3 solutions she could reasonably propose. Ji-hwan found out about the networking event through a contact who'd attended. The man called on a Friday afternoon, not quite sure how to frame it, settling eventually on, "I saw your wife at the Cascade Supply Chain Forum. She was there with her own company." Ji-hwan thanked him for calling. After the call, he sat very still. He was not processing the information. He already understood the information. What he was doing was managing the particular physical reaction that came with it, something in his chest that he would have called irritation if he'd been asked, though it was more complicated than that. He called Dae-sung. "Tell me about Veyne Meridian Advisory." A silence on the other end. "What about it? What do you know about it?" Dae-sung's pause was a fraction too long. "It's a consulting firm. Logistics and corporate risk. She's had it for a few years." Ji-hwan's voice went careful. "How long have you known about it?" "She mentioned it at the Hong Kong dinner 2 years ago. Maybe longer. You were there." Ji-hwan had no memory of this. "How established is it?" he asked. "I don't know the details." "Find out." Dae-sung said nothing for a moment. "Then, Ji-hwan, I say this with respect. Whatever I find out about her company, she built it. It's hers. What you do with that information matters." "Find out," Ji-hwan repeated. "That's all." He ended the call. He sat at his desk and he thought about Amara at a supply chain forum, with her own business cards, talking to people who didn't know her as his wife. Something in the thought made him feel physically unsteady in a way he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't name it precisely. He called a contact who owed him a favor and asked for a quiet background inquiry. Not an investigation, just information. Financial filings. Business registration. Client patterns, if accessible. The contact said he'd have something in a week. Ji-hwan told himself this was simply due diligence. He almost believed it. The call from Ji-hwan came on a Tuesday evening. Amara was at her desk, reviewing a contract amendment when his name appeared on her screen. She looked at it for 2 full rings. Then she answered. "Ji-hwan, where are you?" The question came out sharp, habitual, the same tone he'd used for 8 years when she didn't appear in his field of vision. "At my office," which he stopped, recalibrated. "I want to talk. We have attorneys for that. Not about the legal process." A pause. Something shifted in his voice, a small, reluctant concession. She hadn't heard from him in years. "Just talk." She leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the city was lit up in the particular blue-gray of a Seattle evening when the clouds sit low and the lights reflect off everything. "About what?" she said. "People are saying you're active. Your company, networking events." Another pause. "You've been doing this for a while." "Yes." "How long?" 4 years. Silence. She waited it out. "You built a business," Ji-hwan said finally. "While we were married." "Yes. And you didn't tell me." "I tried twice." Her voice was even. "You called it a hobby. Both times." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. Not the deliberate, strategic pauses of a man who understood how weight is created in conversation, but the involuntary quiet of someone absorbing something painful. "I didn't know it was serious," he said. "I know you didn't." "That's not—" He stopped, restarted. "Did you plan this? Leaving?" "I planned being capable of leaving," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes. For years I hoped I wouldn't need to." Ji-hwan made a sound she couldn't interpret. Not anger. Not the cold authority she knew so well. Something rawer and less composed. "You should have told me," he said. "You should have asked." She let that sit for a moment. Then Ji-hwan, "I'm going to finish my work. Good night." She ended the call. She sat for a moment, with her hands in her lap, noticing the specific quality of the silence that followed, not peaceful, not distressing, just real. A silence that belonged to no one but her. Then she opened the contract amendment. She finished her work. The situation at Haryun Pacific worsened faster than anyone inside the organization had anticipated. The Meridian freight dinner that Park had arranged went poorly. Ji-hwan had attended, which was the first mistake. Meridian's senior VP was the kind of man who made decisions based on comfort levels, and Ji-hwan's presence at what should have been a low-pressure relationship dinner immediately raised the temperature of the table. By the end of the evening, Meridian's VP had been polite, complimentary, and completely non-committal. 2 weeks later, they moved 40% of their Northern Corridor volume to a competitor. Ji-hwan called an emergency meeting, 12 people in the conference room. Park, the regional directors, the 2 remaining senior relationship managers after Choi's departure, 2 members of the legal team, and 3 men whose official titles in the company were vague by design. "Someone is talking," Ji-hwan said. He stood at the head of the table. "Someone in this room, or close to this room, is moving information." The room was very quiet. Park at the far end of the table looked at his hands. "Meridian didn't just decide to diversify their routing," Ji-hwan continued. "That kind of shift takes groundwork. Someone laid that groundwork." He looked around the table. "Who?" No one spoke. "I'll ask differently." Ji-hwan's voice had gone very flat. "Who has been in contact with external parties without my authorization?" One of the regional directors, and a woman named Soo-yeon, who had been with the company for 8 years and had the specific composure of someone who had learned to hold very still when things became dangerous, raised her eyes from the table. "We all have external contacts. That's the nature of what we do." "Professional contacts," Ji-hwan said. "I'm asking about information." "What information?" Soo-yeon asked carefully. "Operational. Financial. Strategic. No one in this room," she began. "How do you know what's in this room?" Ji-hwan's voice cut clean. "You know what you've done. You don't know what everyone else has done." Air in the conference room changed. Park finally looked up. "What you're describing," he said, "is a leak. And if there's a leak, the way to find it is through proper internal review, not by asking 12 people to implicate themselves in a conference room." Ji-hwan looked at him. "I'll coordinate the review," Park continued. "Give me 2 weeks." 1. 2, Park said. The word landed clean and without flinching. "If you want it done properly." Another silence. The room watched Ji-hwan decide. 2 weeks, he said. People exhaled. BC sounds. But what no one said, what everyone in that room understood, with the particular clarity people who had worked for Ji-hwan long enough to read him accurately, was that the leak probably wasn't an act of sabotage. Meridian had moved their volume because Ji-hwan had spent 6 months making the relationship uncomfortable. The operations manager who had resigned had left because Ji-hwan had overridden his risk assessment. The project had underperformed, and Ji-hwan had suggested in a meeting with 4 other people present that the underperformances reflected a competence problem. The 2 junior employees quietly job searching had been doing so since Ji-hwan had missed their team's recognition event to take a personal call and then expressed surprise when reminded that the event had been scheduled at all. These were not conspiracies. These were consequences. Park had said the word 3 weeks ago, and it still hadn't penetrated. The background inquiry came back to Ji-hwan on a Friday afternoon. He read the report alone in his office. Veyne Meridian Advisory. Registered 4 years ago. Tax filings consistent with growing revenue modest in year 1, then steadily climbing, then, in the most recent fiscal year, figures that made Ji-hwan read the page twice. Properties held through a subsidiary entity he'd never heard of, an apartment in a waterfront building, a small commercial unit in Capitol Hill, a partial interest in a mixed-use development in Bellevue. Client list partially reconstructible through public contract. Filings corporate names he recognized. Mid-market companies, a couple of regional players, 2 national brands. A professional network that appeared to span Seattle, Portland, Denver, and Vancouver. Ji-hwan put the report down. He picked it up again. He read the registration date of Veyne Meridian Advisory. 4 years ago, they had been married for 8, which meant that for 4 years, 4 full years of dinners, galas, charity events, private vacations, business trips where she had accompanied him and stood at his elbow and smiled and been introduced as his wife. For 4 years, she had been building something that had nothing to do with him. Not after her frustration had peaked, not as a reaction to one specific incident. 4 years ago, methodically, quietly, without a single detectable moment of drama. He thought about every morning she'd woken before him. Every evening she'd stayed at her laptop while he watched television or made calls in the next room. Every time he'd looked up from his own work and seen her at her desk and assumed she was managing household things, appointments, social calendar, whatever it was she occupied herself with while he ran his actual world. She had been running her own. Something broke open inside Ji-hwan that he didn't have a name for. Not the hot, manageable anger he was used to. Something colder and more permanent, the specific devastation of realizing that the story he'd been telling himself about his marriage but had been wrong in a fundamental way, and that the error had been entirely his. He sat alone in his office while the city moved 42 floors below him. Picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again and dialed Amara's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was calm and professional. "You've reached Amara Veyne of Veyne Meridian Advisory. Please leave a message and I'll return your call within 1 business day." Veyne Meridian Advisory. Her name first. He had never noticed before that her voicemail didn't mention him. He ended the call without leaving a message. Outside his window, the late afternoon light was doing something complicated with the water and the clouds. The kind of light that photographers and painters chased and that Ji-hwan had never particularly noticed before, because there had always been something more pressing in his immediate field of attention. He noticed it now. He noticed it, and then he noticed that noticing it felt like a loss of some kind, though he couldn't have explained to anyone exactly what he had lost or precisely when. He opened his desk drawer. At the back of it, behind the items he used regularly, was a photograph from their 3rd year of marriage, a trip they'd taken to Jeju Island, a rental house near the water. One of the weeks where Ji-hwan had managed to be fully present rather than half elsewhere. In the photograph, Amara was laughing at something off camera. Not the careful social smile he'd watched her deploy at 1,000 events. The real one, the one that made her look slightly surprised by her own amusement. He had liked that laugh. He could not recall the last time he'd heard it. Ji-hwan put the photograph face down on the desk. He called Park Sung-min. "I need a meeting. Tomorrow morning. You, me, no one else." Pause. "About the internal review, about everything." Another pause. 8 o'clock, Park said. 7. Park said nothing for a moment. Then 7. Ji-hwan ended the call. He looked at the background report spread across his desk, the financial figures, the property holdings, the client names, the dates. 4 years. She had been building a life that didn't need him for 4 years, and he had been so certain of his own centrality that he hadn't once looked closely enough to see it. The worst part, the part that sat like something physical in the center of his chest, was that this was not a betrayal. She hadn't taken anything from him. She hadn't gone to his enemies. She had simply built something real while he was too busy being impressive to notice. And now the question that was pressing against the inside of his ribs, the question he couldn't make stop. If she had been capable of all of this for years, the financial independence, the professional network, the quietly prepared exit, then what exactly had she been staying for? Not need, not dependence. She had stayed because she had chosen to. And she had stopped choosing. Ji-hwan sat in his office until the light outside went completely dark. And for the first time in longer than he could measure, Seo Ji-hwan, who had never been uncertain about anything in his adult life, who had built an empire on the bedrock of his own confidence, felt the ground shift beneath him in a way he had absolutely no idea how to manage. The 7 o'clock meeting with Park lasted 40 minutes. Ji-hwan arrived first, which was unusual. He was already at the conference table when Park walked in, no coffee in front of him, no phone out, just sitting with both hands flat on the table, the way a man sits when he has decided to listen rather than perform. Park sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Tell me what you actually think," Ji-hwan said. "Not what you think I want to hear." Park looked at him steadily. "You won't like it. Tell me anyway." Park leaned back. He was a careful man, economical with words in the way that people become when they have spent years working adjacent to someone volatile. He had learned precisely how much truth Ji-hwan could absorb before it became a problem. And he had learned to stay inside that boundary with the consistency of a man who valued his own employment. But Ji-hwan's face this morning was different. Something in it had gone quieter than usual. Less defended. Park decided to take the risk. The leak you're looking for doesn't exist, he said. Meridian left because you made the relationship uncomfortable. Choi left because you humiliated him in front of his team over a timeline failure that your decision accelerated. The 2 junior staff who are job searching. I have the names. By the way, it took me 4 days they're leaving because this organization has stopped feeling like a place where competence is rewarded. He paused. These are internal problems with internal causes. You are the cause. Ji-hwan didn't move. And the criminal side? Park continued because Ji-hwan had not stopped him. 3 of the Pacific Corridor contacts have reduced their volume through us. Quietly, no confrontation, no explanation, just less. That's what it looks like when people in that world are pulling back without wanting to trigger a response. Park set his hands on the table. That's a trust problem. And trust problems in that world don't get fixed with pressure. Ji-hwan looked at the table. You asked me what I actually think, Park said. That's what I actually think. A long silence. What do you recommend? Ji-hwan said finally. Park looked at him. In 11 years, Ji-hwan had never asked him that question directly. He had asked for options. He had asked for analysis. He had never asked for a recommendation, because asking for a recommendation implied the possibility that someone else's judgment was as valid as his own. Park absorbed the significance of the question without commenting on it. Start with the internal problems, he said. Stabilize the legitimate side first. The other side will read that stability and respond accordingly. You can't manage the external perception when the internal reality is fracturing. Ji-hwan nodded once. Slow in the divorce? Park said carefully. What about it? It's affecting your decision-making. Park kept his voice neutral. That's not a criticism. It's an observation. You haven't been sleeping. You've been pushing harder in response to pressure. That pushing harder won't resolve. The situation with Amara it's destabilizing you, and it's visible. Ji-hwan's jaw tightened. I'm handling it. You're not, Park said. Flat. Final. And the people around you know you're not, which is making everything worse because they don't know how to calibrate to you right now, so they're defaulting to caution when you need them to default to initiative. Ji-hwan was quiet for a moment. She built a company, he said. 4 years. I didn't know. Park said nothing. Did you know? Ji-hwan looked at him directly. Pause. I knew she had business interests. Did you know the scope of it? Not the scope. Park held his gaze. But I knew she wasn't the person you described her as. Publicly, the sentence arrived like something cold, dropped into still water. Ji-hwan looked away. 7 meeting, he said. I'll have my assistant set a schedule. I want all regional directors one-on-one this week. Starting today. Park nodded. He stood. He was almost at the door when Ji-hwan spoke again. Park. He stopped. If you had been in her... Ji-hwan began, then stopped. Reformulated. If you had been building something quietly for 4 years, would you have told me? Park considered it. No, he said. He left. Ji-hwan sat alone in the conference room for a long time after that. The federal investigation that had been circling Ji-hwan's organization for 22 months outside appeared. This was intentional. The lead investigator was a woman named Dana Reyes, 44 years old, 11 years with the Financial Crimes Unit, kind of methodical and unhurried that most people in her field stopped being after their first major case. Patience was expensive. Dana Reyes had learned the opposite lesson. She had learned that the subjects who were most certain they couldn't be touched were the ones who could be waited out. She had been waiting out Ji-hwan for almost 2 years. The problem was not evidence of criminal activity. There was a sufficient architecture of that, assembled carefully through financial tracing, surveillance of key associates, and the natural paperwork generated by organizations that try to make illegal money look like legal money. The problem was linkage, the clean, prosecutable line between Ji-hwan and specific decisions that a defense attorney couldn't route around. She needed someone on the inside. She had made 3 approaches in the past year. 2 had been declined cleanly. 1 had promised cooperation and then gone silent after a weekend in which Dana suspected someone had said something persuasive enough to change the calculation. Then, 6 weeks after the dinner party that ended Ji-hwan's marriage, Dana Reyes received a call. She listened. At the end of the call, she said, "We need to meet in person. Not your location. Mine." Amara did not know about the federal investigation. She knew it existed in the abstract, in the way that anyone who had spent 8 years married to a man like Ji-hwan and who possessed functioning intelligence and access to financial documents, understood that the possibility was always there, circling. But she had no specific knowledge of Dana Reyes, no knowledge of the 3 prior approach attempts, and no knowledge of what had set the investigation into motion again. What she knew was that on a Wednesday morning in the 7th week after the dinner, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. "Ms. Veyne?" A woman's voice. Professional. The specific register of someone who has learned to make official calls sound conversational. "Yes, my name is Dana Reyes. I'm a federal investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit. I wonder if we could find time to talk." Amara sat very still at her desk. "About what?" she said. "About Harian Pacific Holdings. And about your knowledge of its operations during your marriage to Seo Ji-hwan." The city beyond the window looked exactly the same as it had 3 seconds earlier. The container ships moved, the clouds sat low, a seabird crossed her field of vision and disappeared. "I'm going to give you my attorney's number," Amara said. "Course." Dana Reyes's voice didn't change register. "I expected that. I want you to know before you do that you are not a subject in this investigation. Potential witness. There's a significant difference in terms of how this conversation goes." "My attorney," Amara repeated. "Absolutely." A pause. "Ms. Veyne, I reviewed your business filings. Veyne Meridian Advisory. Your financials are clean. Your operations are completely separate from his." Another pause. "I just want a conversation." Amara hung up. She sat for 90 seconds not moving. Then she called her attorney. The attorney's name was Christine Park, no relation to Park Sung-min, and she had been managing Amara's divorce proceedings with the quiet, focused efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of high-conflict marital dissolution that money and ego could produce. When Amara explained the call, Christine was quiet for a moment. "They reached out directly to you," she said. "Yes." "Not through me?" "No." Direct call. Christine made a sound that was not quite a sigh but occupied the same space. "Okay. Don't contact her again without me present. Don't call Ji-hwan or anyone in his organization. Don't discuss this call with anyone." "I understand. I mean anyone, Amara. I understand." Pause. "Are you all right?" Amara looked at the window. "I'm fine. This doesn't change your situation if you've had no involvement." "I haven't." "I know. Then you're a witness at most, and we control the terms of any conversation." Christine's voice was steady, professional, exactly what Amara needed in that moment. "I'll call them today. Don't worry." Amara thanked her and ended the call. She sat back in her chair. For the first time in 7 weeks, she felt something close to fear, not for herself, not for her company or her finances or her legal standing, but a specific and unexpected fear for Ji-hwan. Not love. She was clear-eyed enough to know that what she felt was not love, or not the simple version of it. But 8 years of shared life did not dissolve in 7 weeks, and the idea of federal prosecution, of what that meant in practical terms for a man she had known intimately, that landed in her chest with a weight she hadn't anticipated. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she opened her calendar. She had 3 calls that afternoon. She took all 3. The meeting between Christine Park and Dana Reyes happened 4 days later, at a federal building downtown. Amara was present. She had dressed carefully, not in the way she used to dress for Ji-hwan's events, curated to reduce her visibility, but in the way she dressed for her own professional meetings: a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, comfortable heels. Clothes of a woman who worked. Dana Reyes was shorter than Amara had imagined, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away without effort, not expressionless, exactly, but managed. She had brown eyes and a legal pad and a folder she didn't open during the initial introductions. They sat down. Christine established the ground rules in language that was polite and absolute. Amara was present voluntarily. She was not a subject. She would answer questions within defined parameters. Any questions outside those parameters would be declined without implication. Dana Freyas listened without interrupting. I appreciate your time, she said when Christine had finished. She looked at Amara. I'll be direct. We've been building a case against Haryan Pacific for almost 2 years. The criminal network operating beneath the legitimate business structure. She paused. I assume you were aware of the criminal side. Amara looked at her. I was aware that my husband operated in areas that weren't entirely legitimate. I didn't have specific knowledge of operations. But you had access to the household financial structures. Some of them. The ones relevant to our shared accounts and property. Dana Reyes made a note. Did you ever observe financial transfers that seemed inconsistent with the legitimate business operations? Christine put her hand up. Amara, you don't need to answer that. Amara looked at Christine, then at Dana Reyes. I observed things I didn't fully understand. I didn't investigate them. I wasn't part of the criminal organization. I was his wife. Dana Reyes wrote something. The investigation has identified a specific financial corridor, she said. Pacific Northwest to Vancouver. We believe Ji-hwan personally authorized 2 transfers in the past 14 months that are directly traceable. She set her pen down. If you have any documentation, personal financial records, emails, anything from the household that touched those accounts, it would be relevant. I have nothing that would help you, Amara said. Are you certain? She's answered the question, Christine said. Dana Reyes looked at Amara with the specific patience of someone who has been doing this long enough to know when a conversation has more room in it. Ms. Veyne, she said, I want to be honest with you. This investigation is going to move forward, whether or not you participate. What you have the opportunity to do right now is to make sure that when it concludes, and it will conclude, your position is unambiguous. She paused. You left him. Your finances are separate. Your company is clean. But proximity creates questions, and questions create complications. And I would rather have a conversation with you now than have my colleagues knocking on your door later in a context that's less comfortable for everyone. The room was quiet. Amara looked at her hands for a moment. If I had documentation, she said carefully, what would the process look like? Christine's head turned sharply. Amara met her attorney's eyes. I'm asking hypothetically. Christine's expression said that she did not consider this hypothetical, but she let it pass. Dana Reyes explained the process. Amara listened. She asked 2 precise questions. She thanked Dana Reyes for her time, rose, shook hands, and left with Christine at her elbow. In the hallway outside, Christine walked 3 paces ahead of her before stopping and turning around. What documentation, she said. Amara looked at the far end of the hallway. The window there faced west. Wrong direction. In the early years, she said slowly, when Ji-hwan first brought me into the household financial management, he asked me to help organize some records. For the holding company, she paused. I kept copies of everything I touched. I do that. I always do that. Christine stared at her. I didn't know what half of it meant, Amara said. I thought I was just being organized. Where are the copies? In the filing cabinet, in my office, in the second room. Christine was very quiet for a moment. Amara, that cabinet has been in my apartment since I moved in. Yes, she looked at Christine directly. Before the separation. Another silence. You need to tell me exactly what's in it, Christine said. I know, today, I know. They walked toward the elevators. Amara pressed the button and watched the number count down from 14. She had not planned this. She needed Christine to understand that she had not planned to be standing in a federal building hallway, discussing documents she'd been holding for years without fully understanding their weight. She had kept copies because she was thorough, because her instinct for documentation was so deeply ingrained that it had operated independently of strategy, without deliberate intent. But intent, she was beginning to understand, was not the only thing that mattered. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside. The doors closed. Ji-hwan found out about the meeting 2 days later. The source was not someone he'd planted. It was a federal building administrative employee who owed a favor to someone, who owed a favor to someone. 3 connections from Ji-hwan, the kind of porous information channel that exists in any city where criminal networks and governmental structures have shared enough geography for long enough. The information arrived via Daesung, who called Ji-hwan at 6 in the evening and asked to meet in person. They met at the private room of a restaurant Ji-hwan owned through a subsidiary. No staff present. Daesung poured his own water and set the bottle down and looked at Ji-hwan across a table set for two people who were not going to eat. Amara met with a federal investigator, Daesung said. Ji-hwan's face did not change when 4 days ago. Downtown Federal Building. Her attorney was with her. What did she say? I don't have that. Then what do you have? Daesung looked at him steadily. I have the fact of the meeting. And I have, he paused. A concern. Ji-hwan waited. She was in your household for 8 years, Daesung said. She had access to financial records in the early period. We both know there were documents that moved through the household account structures before the offshore layering was refined. He kept his voice level. If she kept anything from that period, she didn't. Ji-hwan said it immediately, with the flat certainty of a man who has decided something is true because the alternative is intolerable. Daesung looked at him. Amara is not that person, Ji-hwan said. She's not going to cooperate with a federal investigation against me. Ji-hwan. Daesung leaned forward slightly. You just told the woman in front of 12 witnesses that she was nothing without you. And then she left, and now she's meeting with federal investigators. He paused. I'm not saying she planned this from the start. I'm saying people do things in response to how they've been treated. And you treated her in a very specific way. She's not going to... You don't know that. Daesung's voice cut clean and direct. You assumed she had no independent resources, and she had 4 years of them. You assumed she had no exit plan, and she had an apartment, a company, and a financial advisor. You have been wrong about her in every concrete way a person can be wrong about someone. And now you're telling me you're certain about what she will or won't do with federal investigators. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. Ji-hwan's jaw moved once. Find out what she has, he said. Ji-hwan, I'm not asking you to approach her. I'm asking you to find out if she has documents. From the early years. From the household records. Daesung sat back. And if she does, Ji-hwan looked at him. It was a look Daesung had seen directed at other people over 11 years. He had never had it directed at him. Then we have a different conversation, Ji-hwan said quietly. Daesung held the look for a long moment. Then he stood. I'll find out, he said. But I want you to hear something first. Ji-hwan waited. Whatever she has, whatever she told them. She left because of how you treated her, not because she was building a case against you. Daesung picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. If you go after her, if you make her into an enemy, you will be creating the thing you're afraid of. He paused at the table's edge. She's not your enemy right now. Don't make her one. Ji-hwan said nothing. Daesung left. Ji-hwan sat alone in the private room. The restaurant moved quietly around him. On the other side of the door, the sound of the kitchen, the muffled conversation of dinner service, the ordinary functioning of a world that had not yet broken apart. His phone was on the table, in front of him. He picked it up. He opened Amara's contact. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment. He set the phone down. He picked up his water glass and held it without drinking. He was not at this moment afraid of federal investigators. He had attorneys for federal investigators, expensive ones, people who had made careers from the specific art of keeping men like Ji-hwan at a distance from consequence. He was not afraid of the investigation. What he was afraid of, what was sitting in his chest with the specific weight of something he could not lift or move or manage away, was the thought of Amara in that federal building, sitting across from a woman he'd never met, speaking in the calm and organized way she had when she was fully in command of herself. Not as his wife, not as a dependent, a project, a woman who wouldn't last a week, as Amara Veyne. And the unbearable question that came with that image was not what she had said. It was what she had felt, sitting there. Whether she had felt anything for him at all. Whether, in the careful architecture of the life she had been building quietly for years, he had been anything other than the situation she was planning to leave. Ji-hwan pressed his knuckles against the edge of the table. He had made his empire from certainty. Right now, he was certain of nothing, except that the woman he had publicly declared nothing without some sitting in a federal building office explaining herself to investigators with a composure that he recognized, even from a distance, as the composure of someone who had nothing to hide. And he was no longer sure he could say the same. Christine Park spread every document across the conference table in her office. Took 40 minutes. Amara sat on one side, and Christine walked the length of the table on the other, touching corners, reading headers, making notes on a separate legal pad with the focused attention of someone building a picture. When she reached the last page, she stopped. She stood at the end of the table with her pen pressed against her lip. "Amara," she said, "some of these are significant. I know. You understand what this means for the divorce proceedings? Tell me." Christine walked back to her chair and sat down. "If you provide this documentation to the federal investigation, Ji-hwan's legal team will argue it was obtained through the marital relationship in a way that implicates you. You said I'm not a subject. You're not. But his defense will try to complicate that. They will attempt to characterize you as a participant." Christine's voice was level, but her eyes were serious. "They will make the next 6 months very uncomfortable." Amara looked at the documents spread across the table. She had organized them herself, years ago, labeled each folder, filed each copy in the exact sequence they arrived, noted the dates in her own handwriting in the margins. The time she had done it because she did everything that way, thoroughly carefully, without skipping steps. She hadn't known what she was holding. She knew now. "What happens if I don't provide them?" she said. "The investigation continues without them. May reach the same conclusion eventually. May not." Christine held her gaze. "Ji-hwan has very good attorneys." Another silence. "And what happens to me either way?" Amara said. Christine exhaled. "Either way, you're a woman who is married to a man with a criminal organization, and that will follow you, in some form, regardless of what you decide. The question is whether you walk away from this as a witness who cooperated, or as someone whose connection to the material is ambiguous." She paused. "I know this is not the position you asked to be in." "No," Amara said. "It's not." She looked at the documents. 8 years of her life had passed in the same house as these records. She had touched them, organized them, stored them, not understanding their weight, not asking questions she hadn't been equipped to ask. Because she had been a woman in a marriage that required her to be competent about surfaces and incurious about depths. She had not been his partner. She had been his setting. And now she was sitting in a lawyer's office looking at the evidence of his world, while her own world, the one she'd built at 3 a.m, when he slept, waited in her office across the city, real and functional and entirely hers. She pressed her hands flat against the table. "Tell me what cooperation looks like," she said. Step by step, Christine picked up her legal pad. And somewhere across the city, in a restaurant he owned through a subsidiary, Ji-hwan's phone screen lit up with a message from Dae-sung. 4 words: "She has the documents." Ji-hwan read it once. Then he set the phone down on the white tablecloth of the private dining room and looked at the far wall with the specific stillness of a man who has just felt the floor of his entire world shift beneath him in a direction he cannot reverse. Ji-hwan did not sleep that night. He sat in the private dining room until the kitchen staff finished their closing work and the restaurant went quiet around him. And then he sat some more, in the dark, with his phone on the table and Dae-sung's 4 words on the screen. "She has the documents." He had spent 15 years building an organization that survived on the principle that information was power, and that the man who controlled information controlled outcomes. He understood, with the precision of someone who had applied this principle in lethal ways, exactly what Amara's possession of those early financial records meant. It meant the linkage Dana Reyes had been missing for 22 months was sitting in a filing cabinet in an east-facing apartment across the city. It meant the careful distance his attorneys had maintained between Ji-hwan and specific decisions, the distance that made prosecution difficult, that kept the architecture of culpability just ambiguous enough to survive aggressive legal scrutiny could collapse in a single deposition. It meant he had handed a federal investigator the key to his exposure, and he had handed it to her through 8 years of dismissing the woman who had been quietly, methodically, filing every document she touched. Ji-hwan pressed both hands against the table and stood. He walked out of the restaurant into the cold Seattle night and stood on the sidewalk while the city moved around him late traffic, a couple arguing half a block away, the smell of rain on concrete. He called his lead attorney at 11:47 at night. The man answered on the third ring, voice thick with interrupted sleep, and became immediately alert when Ji-hwan said his name. "I need you in my office. 7 tomorrow morning." "What's the situation?" "Documentation. From the early holding structure. My wife may have copies." A silence. Then, with the controlled precision of a man whose billing rate was $400 an hour and who had just calculated that this conversation was going to become very expensive, "Don't contact her. Don't contact anyone connected to the investigation. Don't discuss specifics with anyone until I'm in your office." 7, Ji-hwan repeated. He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then he called Dae-sung. "How certain are you?" he said. "The source is reliable." Dae-sung's voice was careful. Awake, he had clearly been waiting for this call. The attorney meeting at the federal building was confirmed. "The nature of the documentation matches what would have moved through the household counts in years 2 and 3 of your marriage." Years 2 and 3. Ji-hwan thought about years 2 and 3. Amara had joined the household financial management in their second year together at his own request, not because he'd wanted to include her, but because the volume of paperwork had become unwieldy, and she was organized in the particular, thorough way of someone who had learned early that details mattered. He had handed her the task with the specific carelessness of a man who doesn't believe the person he's handing something to is capable of understanding its full significance. She had understood. She had filed everything. She had kept copies. "Does she know what she has?" Ji-hwan said. "I think she knows now." A pause. "Ji-hwan, what are you going to do?" "Handle it." "Define handle." "I'm going to talk to my attorney." "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." Dae-sung's voice had gone very quiet. "I need you to tell me right now that you are not going to do something that makes this worse. Because there is a version of this that gets worse very fast." Ji-hwan was silent. "She's cooperating with a federal investigation," he said. "You don't know that yet. She met with them. She has the documents." "What other interpretation?" "She's a woman protecting herself," Dae-sung said sharply. "After 8 years of being made to feel like she had nothing. Of course she's going to protect herself. That is not the same thing as going after you." A pause. "Don't make it the same thing." Ji-hwan ended the call. He got into his car. He drove home. He did not sleep. The attorney's name was Michael Seo, no relation. A coincidence of surnames that had struck Ji-hwan as mildly amusing when they first met, and which now carried no significance at all. He arrived at 6:58 and was at the conference table, with his briefcase open, by the time Ji-hwan walked in at 7 exactly. Ji-hwan laid out what he knew. Michael Seo listened without interrupting, taking notes in the small, precise handwriting of a man who trusted his own shorthand. When Ji-hwan finished, Michael set his pen down and looked at the table for a moment. "How thorough is she?" he said. "Thorough." Ji-hwan said it without hesitation. "She doesn't skip steps. So if she filed copies of the household records from years 2 and 3, they'll be organized, labeled, and dated." "Yes." Michael exhaled slowly through his nose. "Okay. Here's where we are. If she cooperates fully with the investigation and provides those records, our timeline for defensible ambiguity compresses significantly. The offshore layering wasn't clean until year 4. Anything from years 2 and 3 has direct attribution problems." He paused. "It doesn't mean prosecution is certain. It means the calculation changes." "How much?" Michael looked at him directly. "Significantly." Ji-hwan absorbed this. "Options," he said. "Legally, your options are limited." Michael's voice was measured. "You cannot approach her directly. You cannot approach anyone who would approach her on your behalf. Any contact that could be construed as pressure or intimidation becomes obstruction, and obstruction hands the investigation exactly what it needs to escalate to a different level." He paused. "Legally, the only move is to get ahead of the narrative. Proactive engagement with investigators. Controlled disclosure. Cooperation in exchange for defined parameters." Ji-hwan looked at him. You're telling me to cooperate with the federal investigation. I'm telling you that cooperation, negotiated on your terms, from a position of relative strength, is a different thing from being dragged into cooperation after they've built the case with her documentation. Michael held his gaze. One of those you control. The other you don't. The silence in the conference room was total. Ji-hwan stood. He walked to the window. 42 floors below, Seattle was doing what Seattle did on gray October mornings, moving, functioning, indifferent to the specific agony of powerful men watching their certainties come apart. If I cooperate, he said, what happens to the organization? Parts of it survive. The legitimate operations, restructured. Some of the network, Michael stopped, chose the words carefully. Some of the network gets sacrificed. That's the honest answer. People, Ji-hwan said. Not a question. Yes. Ji-hwan pressed one hand against the cold glass of the window. 15 years of building, of loyalty maintained through fear and generosity in roughly equal measure. Men who had trusted him with their freedom, because he had projected the absolute certainty that he would never put them in a position where that trust became a liability. He had put them in that position, not through a rival's attack, not through a federal conspiracy. Through the accumulated weight of his own decisions, the casual dismissal of the woman he'd married, the 8 years of certainty that she was less than she was. Evening he'd handed her a choice in front of 12 witnesses, and been so sure of her submission that he hadn't considered what happened if he was wrong. He had been wrong. Give me 48 hours, he said. Ji-hwan, 48 hours. He turned from the window. I need to do something first. Park Sung-min found out about the federal investigation from Daesung at 9 in the morning. He arrived at Ji-hwan's office at 9:20 without an appointment, walked past the assistant, who tried to stop him, and closed the door behind himself. Ji-hwan looked up from his desk. Tell me it's not as bad as he said, Park said. Ji-hwan looked at him. Park sat down heavily. How long have we known about the investigation? We've known it existed for 2 years. How long have we known it was close? Ji-hwan said nothing. Park pressed both hands against his knees. The documentation, the household records. He looked at Ji-hwan with an expression that was not anger, something more exhausted than anger. She kept copies. Yes, because she organized them in year 2. Yes. Park made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You gave her the filing. Yes. Because you needed someone to handle the paperwork, and you didn't think she'd. Park stopped. Jaw worked once. You didn't think she was paying attention. Jean was quiet. Park stood. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to Ji-hwan, looking at the same city Ji-hwan had looked at an hour earlier, and Jane watched the set of the man's shoulders and understood that Park was deciding something. I have a family, Park said. He wasn't raising his voice. That was almost worse, the flatness of it. I have a daughter in her first year at university. I have a wife who doesn't ask questions because she trusts me when I tell her everything is fine. He turned around. I need to know whether everything is fine. Ji-hwan held his gaze. I'm working on it, he said. That's not an answer. The only one I have right now. Park looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, not quite fury. The particular expression of a man who has been loyal for 11 years and is now calculating, for the first time, whether loyalty has a cost he isn't willing to pay. 48 hours, Ji-hwan said. Give me 48 hours. And then what? Then I'll tell you everything. All of it. Park searched his face. 48 hours, he said. He picked up his jacket, and Ji-hwan. He stopped at the door. Whatever you're planning to do in those 48 hours, don't make it worse. He left. Ji-hwan sat alone. He opened his desk drawer. He took out the photograph from Jeju Island. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. Amara was in a client meeting when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She didn't check it during the meeting. She finished, thanked the client, walked them to the elevator, and returned to her desk before picking up the phone. The text said, "We need to talk. Not through attorneys. Not through anyone. Just us, please." She stared at it. She knew the number. She had deleted his contact, but she knew the number the way you know things you've held for years. She called Christine. He texted me directly. Christine's response was immediate. Don't reply. Forward it to me. I'll address it through his attorney. He said, please. A pause. Amara, I know. She set the phone down. I know. She forwarded the message. She went back to work. 40 minutes later, her desk phone rang the office line, not her cell. Her assistant patched it through. Ms. Veyne? A man's voice. Not Ji-hwan. Older, measured, the practiced calm of someone who made difficult calls professionally. My name is Michael Seo. I represent Seo Ji-hwan. I'm calling to request. Call Christine Park, Amara said. She's my attorney. You have her number. Ms. Veyne. I understand that's the appropriate. Call Christine Park. She hung up. She sat for a moment with her hand still on the receiver. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, a gesture she'd developed over years of managing her own physiological responses to situations. Ji-hwan created the way the body holds what the face has learned not to show. She breathed in. She breathed out. Her phone buzzed again. A second text from the same number. I know I have no right to ask. I know I've given you every reason not to, but there are people in my organization who don't deserve what happens to them if this goes the way it's going. Men with families. Men who followed my decisions, not theirs. Please, one conversation. Amara read it twice. She set the phone face down on the desk. She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the water. The men with families. Park Sung-min had a daughter in university. She knew that. She had met the daughter, a quiet, serious girl at a company function 3 years ago, who had shaken Amara's hand and asked about her work with the genuine curiosity of someone who was used to adults deflecting that question. Amara had answered honestly. The girl had lit up. She thought about Park Sung-min's daughter. She pressed her fingers against the window glass. She was not responsible for Ji-hwan's decisions. She had not built his organization. She had not thought his financial structure, or approved his corridor arrangements, or made the specific choices that had put his people in proximity to federal investigation. She was not responsible. She was also not made of stone. She walked back to her desk. She typed a reply. My attorney's office. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. She will be present for the entire conversation. Those are my terms. She hit send before she could think herself out of it. Called Christine immediately. He's coming tomorrow at 10, she said. Christine's silence lasted 3 full seconds. Amara, I know. You cannot discuss the documentation. I know. If he says anything that sounds like a negotiation related to the investigation, you stop talking and let me handle it. Christine. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I know. I need to see him one time. And then I'll know what to do. Another pause. 10 o'clock, Christine said. My office. Ji-hwan arrived at 9:55. Amara was already there, seated on one side of the conference table with Chris beside her, and a legal pad she didn't intend to write on placed in front of her, because having something to do with her hands felt preferable to having nothing. When the conference room door opened, her first involuntary reaction was purely physical, a tightening across her shoulders, the specific muscle memory of 8 years of reading his moods from the way he entered rooms. He looked terrible. Not devastated, not broken. Ji-hwan would never allow himself to look broken in front of an audience, even an audience of one. But the sleeplessness was visible, and the control he was exercising was visible in a way it had never been before, because previously it hadn't required effort. He sat across from her. Michael Seo sat beside him. The 4 of them looked at each other across a conference table in Christine Park's bright downtown office, and the particular absurdity of the formality attorneys present, legal pads ready. The machinery of managed conflict deployed around what was essentially a wreckage of a marriage sat in the room with them, like a 5th presence. Thank you for coming, Ji-hwan said. He was looking at Amara, not at his attorney, not at Christine, not at the table. At her. Say what you came to say, Amara said. He exhaled. His hands were flat on the table, the same gesture she'd developed for managing her own composure, and the recognition of it landed in her chest with an unexpected sting. I'm not here to threaten you, he said. I want to say that first, because you have every reason to expect that. And he stopped. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Christine said. A conversation. He looked at Amara, between her and me. Christine opened her mouth. "It's all right," Amara said. Christine closed her mouth. Ji-hwan looked at his hands for a moment. Then back up. "I know about the meeting with the investigator," he said. Amara said nothing. "I know you have documents from year 2 and year 3. His voice was even, but underneath it she could hear something effortful, the sound of a man maintaining a tone that does not come naturally to him. "I'm not asking you not to cooperate with the investigation." She blinked. "I'm asking you to understand who else gets hurt," he said. "Park Sung-min. His daughter starts her 2nd year in spring. He has been with me for 11 years, and he has done his job and followed my decisions, and he does not deserve." Ji-hwan's jaw tightened briefly. "There are others. 8 people, maybe 10, who are in the exposure radius of whatever the investigation identifies, and whose involvement was—" He stopped again. "Minor, peripheral. They did what I told them to do." The room was very quiet. "You're asking me to protect them," Amara said. "I'm asking you to consider them. That's the same thing." "No." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you to know they exist. What you do with that." His voice fractured almost imperceptibly. "That's yours." Amara looked at him. 8 years of dinners and silences in 3A. Spreadsheets, and a man who had never once asked what she was working on. 8 years of being made smaller by inches, not by violence, not by cruelty of the cartoonish kind that was easy to name and leave, but by the steady, casual erosion of a man who simply never looked closely enough to see her. She looked at him now. He looked back. And she understood, in the specific way that you understand things that have been true for years, but required distance, to see clearly that Ji-hwan had loved her. Not well, not with any wisdom or generosity or genuine attention to what she needed, but in the flawed, self-referential way of someone who experiences love primarily as an extension of their own ego. He had wanted her, had chosen her, had kept her. It was not enough. It had never been enough. But it was real, and she acknowledged it, without sentimentality. "I haven't made any decisions yet," she said finally. "About the investigation, about the documentation. I'm still in conversation with my attorney about what I'm required to do versus what I choose to do." She held his gaze. "The most honest thing I can tell you." Ji-hwan nodded once. Then quietly, with the particular difficulty of a man for whom this sentence was genuinely the hardest thing in the room, "I'm sorry. For the dinner. For 8 years of dinners. For every time he stopped." His voice had gone rough. "I used you as proof of something. I made you a measurement of my own worth, and you were sitting across from me building an entire world, and I was—" He exhaled sharply. "I was too busy looking at myself." Christine was very still beside Amara. Michael Seo was looking at the table. Amara looked at Ji-hwan. She felt many things, and none of them were clean or simple or easily named. She did not forgive him. Not in this room, not in this conversation. Forgiveness was a longer and more private process than a conference table could hold. But she heard him. She allowed that much to be real. "The people in your organization," she said. "Give Christine a list. Names, roles, degree of involvement. She'll review it." She looked at Christine, who nodded once with the compressed expression of someone managing a significant amount of professional disagreement in real time. "I'm not making you any promises, but I'll consider it." Ji-hwan looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, something in his face came apart. Not dramatically, not with tears or gesture, or any of the apparatus of performed emotion he might have brought to a room where performance served him. Just a small genuine fracture in the surface of his control, there and then gone. "Thank you," he said. Amara looked at the table. She was not going to respond to that. She was not going to tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, and she was not going to perform graciousness. She didn't fully feel because she was done performing things for his comfort. She was also not going to be cruel. She looked up. "Are we finished?" she said. Ji-hwan looked at her for one more moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood. He was almost at the door when it happened. Michael Seo's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, a reflexive glance, the kind that bypasses decision-making, and his face changed. Amara saw it, Christine saw it. Michael picked up the phone. He read the screen. He looked at Ji-hwan. We need to step out, he said. His voice had gone completely flat. Ji-hwan read his attorney's face. Something moved through Ji-hwan's expression, not fear exactly, but the precursor to it, the moment before he decides what to do with information it doesn't want. What is it? Ji-hwan said. Michael looked at Amara and Christine. Excuse us for a moment. They stepped out. The conference room door closed. Amara looked at Christine. What just happened? She said. Christine was already on her phone, texting. She read something. Her expression sharpened. She looked at Amara. The investigation, she said carefully, appears to have moved. Moved how? Christine set her phone down. Dasan Kwan, she said. Ji-hwan's senior lieutenant. He made contact with federal investigators 3 days ago. She held Amara's gaze. He's been cooperating since Monday. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Amara sat very still. Dae-sung. The man who had called her in the first weeks after she left to tell her Ji-hwan was not doing well. The man who had sat at Ji-hwan's right hand for 11 years. The man who had told Ji-hwan in a restaurant 3 nights ago that she was not his enemy. While Ji-hwan had been calculating how to protect his empire, while Amara had been sitting in federal offices deciding what to do with documents she'd filed in her own thorough, careful way, Dae-sung had been having a different conversation entirely. From inside, the door to the conference room opened. Ji-hwan walked back in. His face was completely still in the way that faces go still when the emotion is too large to process into expression. He looked at Amara. She looked at him. And in the space between them, across the conference table, across the wreckage of an 8-year marriage, across all the distances that pride and certainty and the slow accumulation of small cruelties had created, they both understood that the situation had just moved entirely outside either of their control. The man Ji-hwan had trusted most, beside Park Sung-min, beside perhaps anyone, had decided that loyalty had a cost he was no longer willing to pay. And the investigation that had circled for 22 months had just walked through the front door. Ji-hwan sat down. He looked at the table. When he looked up, his eyes found Amara's, and what was in them was not anger, not accusation, not the cold authority she had spent 8 years learning to read and navigate. Just a man sitting in the ruins of everything he'd built, understanding for the first time, with complete clarity, how he'd gotten there, and knowing with absolute certainty that there was not one thing left in his power to stop. The conference room did not change when the door closed behind Michael Seo. The same gray light came through the same windows. The same table held the same untouched water glasses and legal pads. But the air in the room had shifted in the specific way that air shifts when the last structural support of a situation has been knocked out, and everyone present is now standing in the debris, calculating what remains and what does not. Ji-hwan sat at the table with both hands flat against its surface, and his face doing something she had never seen it do in 8 years of watching it, across rooms and tables, and the particular intimacy of a shared life. It was not the cold authority. It was not the performed confidence. It was not even the wounded pride she had seen at the dinner, which now felt like a different geological era. It was the face of a man who has run at full speed into the full weight of what his choices cost, and found the impact larger than anything he had calculated. Amara sat across from him. She did not fill the silence immediately. She had learned in 8 years of living with someone who used silence as a weapon, that silence itself was neutral. It was only the intention behind it that made it cruel or kind or simply honest. She sat in it the way she sat in everything now, present, clear-eyed, not performing a single thing. Dae-sung, she said finally. Ji-hwan looked up. How long, she said. How long had he been unhappy? His jaw moved. 1 year. Maybe more. And you knew, I suspected. He exhaled through his nose. He told me I was making mistakes. Multiple times. The same way Park told me. The same way he stopped. The same way I told you, she said. In the kitchen on a Saturday morning. When I tried to say something about the partner renegotiation, and you told me to stick to my spreadsheets. The sentence arrived in the room without any heat behind it. She was not saying it to wound him. She was saying it because it was the truth, and the truth was what this moment required, and she was done arranging reality into shapes that protected him from it. Ji-hwan pressed his knuckles briefly against the table. Yes, it's the same thing, she said, every time. You decide how the world is arranged, and then when the arrangement contradicts reality, you treat the contradiction as the problem rather than the arrangement. She looked at him steadily. Dasung didn't betray you from nowhere. He reached the end of a very long road that you laid down. The same road Park reached the edge of, the same road I was on for 8 years. I know. Do you understand that it wasn't personal, any of it? It was just people running out of room inside a structure that only left room for you. Ji-hwan was quiet for a long moment. The quietness was different from his usual quietness. His usual quiet was strategic, the silence of a man calculating his next move, managing the temperature of a room, deciding how much to reveal and what to keep back. This quiet was something older and more raw, the quiet of a person who has genuinely stopped calculating because the calculation has become beside the point. I understand it now, he said. I didn't understand it while I was inside it. He pressed his hands flat. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I wasn't pretending to believe what I believed. I actually believed it. I genuinely thought I was the organizing principle around which everything else should arrange itself. He looked at his hands. And the fact that I believed it so completely is exactly what made it so destructive. Amara looked at him. Yes, she said, that's exactly it. A silence. What are you going to do, she said. Cooperate. He said it without the pause she had expected, without the hedge or the qualification. Fully. Whatever Michael can negotiate, from here I take it. Whatever I have to provide, whatever I have to acknowledge, whatever comes with those acknowledgments, I accept it. He looked up at her. I've spent 15 years believing I could manage outcomes. I understand now that I was only ever delaying them. The delay is over. She held his gaze. The people in your organization, she said. The peripheral ones. The ones who followed orders and are now standing in the radius of this because of decisions you made and they carried out. I'm going to give Michael a list. He said it before she'd finished framing the question, which told her he had been thinking about this already, before the phone call, before Michael walked out. Every person whose role was executory rather than strategic. I'm going to provide the federal investigators with context that distinguishes them from the decisions that were mine. He paused. I can't guarantee the outcome. I don't have that power anymore. But I can make the distinction clear, and I can give them the best possible chance at a fair characterization. Park Sung-min, she said, on the list. His daughter is in her 2nd year. I know, she studied him. All right, she said. The documents, he said. From year 2 and year 3. Your filing cabinet. He held her gaze, and his voice carried none of the command she'd spent years learning to navigate, none of the subtle pressure that had operated beneath the surface of so many of his requests. Just the flat, honest ask of someone who has run out of leverage and knows it. I'm not telling you what to do with them. I can't. I understand that. I'm asking you to consider the list when you talk to Christine. To consider it against what you decide to provide and how you frame what you provide. That's all. That's not a small ask, she said. I know it's not. He exhaled. I know I have no standing to make it. I know everything I handed you to make your decision was handed by me. 8 years of dinners and dismissals and public performances at your expense, and whatever you decide I've earned. He pressed his hands flat on the table one more time. I'm asking anyway. Not for me. For the people on the list. The room was very quiet. Amara looked at her hands. She thought about Park Sung-min's daughter. She thought about the 8 years of filing she had done in the thorough, habitual way of someone who simply could not do a task incompletely, who had organized documents she didn't fully understand because organization was what she did. Because even the parts of her life that belonged to his world, she had handled with her full competence and attention because anything less would have felt like a failure of herself rather than a failure of the situation. She thought about what she owed. Not to Ji-hwan. That account was closed. She had paid into it for 8 years, and the balance on his side was a number that could not be settled, and she was not going to spend another day of her life trying to collect on it. But to the people on the list, people who had no filing cabinet, no company registered 4 years ago, no apartment leased 8 months early, no third option constructed in the margins of someone else's life. Who had simply followed orders in an organization that had promised them, the way such organizations always implicitly promise, that loyalty would be returned in kind. Ji-hwan had not returned it, but the costs of that failure was falling on them. "Send the list to Christine," she said. "I'll look at it. I'll consider it against what I decide." She met his eyes. "I'm not making you a promise. I'm telling you I'll look at it." Ji-hwan exhaled a small, controlled exhale, but she heard the thing inside it, the compressed relief of a man who had been holding his breath without knowing it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," she said. "This has nothing to do with you." He held her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "Thank you anyway." Christine came back into the room 4 minutes later. She had the particular composure of an attorney who has just spent 4 minutes in a hallway, doing rapid calculations, and has arrived at a position she can work from. She sat down. She looked at both of them, with the contained, professional attention of someone reading a room without announcing that she's reading it. "His attorney will send a list," Amara said. "Names. Roles. I want to review it before our next session with the investigators." Christine made a note. "And the documents from the cabinet? We'll talk separately." Christine nodded. She looked at Ji-hwan with the brief, calibrated expression of someone who has managed many high-conflict situations and has learned that the moment after the crisis peaks is not the moment for anything other than clean, efficient forward movement. "Your attorney will have my office's contact." Ji-hwan nodded. He stood. He straightened his jacket. She watched him do it, the habitual, reflexive reassembly of presentation, the physical memory of a man who had spent 15 years treating how he appeared as a form of power. The gesture looked different now, smaller. Not pathetic, she had no interest in that reading, but simply human. Just a man pulling himself together after something that had cost him considerably, performing the basic dignity of standing upright. He picked up his phone from the table. He looked at Amara. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained everything that 3 seconds can contain when it sits at the end of 8 years. She saw the regret in it, real and unperformed. She saw the exhaustion. She saw beneath both of those things the specific and painful clarity of a person who has finally understood something they should have understood much earlier and cannot undo the cost of the delay. She looked back at him and let him see her clearly, not the managed version, not the careful presentation she had developed over years of living in proximity to his need to be the most significant person in any room. A sound like green wood splitting, but the actual woman who had built a company in the margins of his life and leased an apartment 8 months before she needed it and organized a filing cabinet that had turned out to matter more than either of them had known. She was not angry. She was not warm. She was simply present and clear and finished in the way that something is finished when it is genuinely complete, rather than merely abandoned. "Take care of yourself," she said. The words were not an endearment. They were not a performance of graciousness she didn't feel. The honest expression of a woman who wished no particular harm, who had never wanted his destruction, even in the moments when his behavior had been most destructive, who had left because she needed to live her own life, and not because she wanted his to collapse, though she understood now fully that the collapse had been coming regardless, built into the architecture of his certainty from the beginning. Ji-hwan nodded once. Then he walked to the door and opened it and stepped through it. The door closed. Christine set her pen down. In the silence that followed, Amara became aware of her own breathing steady, slightly slower than it had been during the conversation. The automatic regulation of a nervous system managing sustained stress with the competence it had developed over years of practice. "Are you all right?" Christine said. Amara looked at her hands on the table, the hands that had pressed flat against white linen almost a year ago, the hands that had signed documents in federal offices, the hands that had opened a laptop at 3 in the morning and built something real in the hours. Ji-hwan spent sleeping with the particular ease of a man who never questioned whether anything he'd decided might be wrong. "Yes," she said, and then because Christine had earned the full answer, "I will be." Both of those things are true. Christine studied her for a moment, with the expression of someone who has spent a career in rooms where people say they are fine and means it sometimes and doesn't other times, and who has learned to tell the difference. Good, she said. She picked up her pen. Then let's talk about those documents. The 6 weeks that followed were the most demanding professional period of Amara's life, and her professional life had already contained years of working in secret, under conditions that most people would have found prohibitively difficult. Christine guided her through 4 sessions with Dana Reyes and the investigation team with the precise, relentless focus of an attorney who had decided her client's interests were going to be protected absolutely and was going to achieve that outcome through competence rather than drama. Every document that crossed the table had been reviewed, characterized, and placed within parameters Christine had established in advance. Amara's role was defined before the first session began and held to consistently through every meeting, a source of corroborating documentation, not a cooperating witness in the prosecutorial sense, not a subject, not a participant. She answered questions in 4 sessions across 11 days. She answered truthfully and completely, and within exactly the scope Christine had defined. In the specific, organized, date-referenced way, she answered everything thoroughly, without skipping steps, with the particular precision of someone whose memory for detail was unusually accurate, and who had, by accident of thorough habit, produced a filing system that constituted one of the more organized evidentiary archives the investigation team had encountered. Dana Reyes, for her part, conducted every session with the contained professional respect of someone who understood that the woman across from her was not required to be there and was choosing to be, and that the choice deserved acknowledgement in the form of clean questions and respected boundaries. At the conclusion of the 4th session, Dana Reyes closed her folder. She looked at Amara with the specific expression of a federal investigator who has reached the end of a process she has been managing for nearly 2 years and is sitting in the particular silence of a completed thing. "You organized these records yourself," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, in year 2 of the marriage." "Yes. And at the time you understood." "I understood that some of the structures were more complex than I had full context for," Amara said. "I didn't have the expertise to interpret what the complexity meant. I had a task, and I completed it the way I complete everything." Dana Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Thoroughly," she said. "Yes." Something moved across the investigator's face, not quite admiration, not quite sympathy, somewhere in the space where professional respect and genuine human recognition overlap. She did not comment on it. She simply closed her folder with the clean, final gesture of someone who has what she came for. "We're done," she said. "Thank you for your time." Amara nodded. She and Christine walked out of the federal building into a November afternoon that was gray and cold and carrying the particular smell of recent rain on concrete that she had always associated with Seattle. Not beautiful exactly, but honest. The smell of a city that doesn't pretend the weather is better than it is. On the sidewalk, Christine stopped. She turned to face Amara with an expression that had shifted over 6 weeks of sustained professional proximity through genuinely difficult circumstances, slightly closer to warmth than pure professional concern. "That's the last of it," she said. "Investigation side, you're done." "And the divorce?" "Final hearing in 3 weeks." Christine held her gaze. "How are you?" Amara took the question seriously. She stood on a November sidewalk outside a federal building, and she actually checked, not performing an answer, not reaching for the automatic reassurance, but genuinely assessing. She was exhausted in the deep way that comes from sustained effort over extended time, the kind of tiredness that lives below the surface and doesn't yield to one good night's sleep. She was clear in a way she hadn't been in years, possibly hadn't been since before the marriage in some essential sense, the clarity of someone who has been through enough to know exactly where they stand and what they're standing on. She was standing outside a federal building on a gray November afternoon, having just completed the most sustained act of honest courage in her adult life. She was still upright. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'll be all right." Christine studied her for a moment. "Good," she said. "Both of those things are exactly right." Ji-hwan's cooperation with the investigation was formalized within 10 days of Michael Seo's return from the conference room hallway. It was not a clean or comfortable process. Michael Seo had spent 15 years managing the legal exposure of a man who had prided himself on operating at a distance from consequence, and he understood better than most what it cost to move from that position to one of active, documented cooperation. He negotiated the terms with the focused care of someone who understood that the terms mattered enormously and that the time available to negotiate them was finite and contracting. Ji-hwan sat in 7 sessions with investigators across 3 weeks. He provided the corridor documentation. He provided the financial mechanisms that had allowed criminal revenue to move through the Harian Pacific structure for 15 years. He answered questions about the Vancouver transfers and the Pacific arrangement with the specific, unmanaged honesty of someone who has decided that the machinery of self-protection has cost more than it's saved and who is no longer willing to operate it. And he provided unprompted the list, 8 names, each one accompanied by a documented characterization of role executory, not strategic, following orders, not issuing them, present in the structure through proximity and loyalty rather than through the decisions that had created the exposure. He spent 2 additional sessions providing context for those 8 names specifically, context that required him to state, in the recorded language of federal testimony, that the decisions that mattered had been his and not theirs. It was the most uncomfortable thing he had done in any room he had ever sat in. He had done things over 15 years that had required a different kind of cost decisions made in the service of an empire that operated outside the law, decisions that had consequences for people he had not always considered fully. He had carried those things with the specific dissociation of a man who had learned to compartmentalize his world into the version that required moral accounting and the version that did not. Sitting in a federal office, on record, naming his own decisions, and their owners, that was a different kind of uncomfortable. That was the discomfort of a man being asked to be fully present in the accounting of his own life, without the compartments, without the distance, without the performance of certainty that had insulated him from his own choices for a very long time. He did it anyway. 3 of the 8 names on the list were excluded from proceedings. 2 others received substantially reduced exposure. Park Sung-min's characterization, when reviewed against the context Ji-hwan had provided, a sound like green woods placed him at a distance from the central decisions that his own attorney subsequently told him represented the difference between catastrophic outcome and a difficult year. Park Sung-min never called Ji-hwan to discuss this. He found out through his attorney on a Tuesday afternoon. A sound like green drove directly to his daughter's university and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the building where she was in a lecture on water systems engineering, thinking about her specific future and the specific narrowness of the margin by which it had remained intact. He did not call Ji-hwan. He did not need to. Some things do not require the phone call to be understood. Harian Pacific Holdings restructured. The business press covered it with the appetite reserved for the dismantling of things that had seemed too established to fall, the kind of coverage that is part autopsy, part cautionary tale, part the specific human fascination with watching certainty come apart. The legitimate shipping operations survived in reduced, supervised, governed form, stripped of the infrastructure that had taken 15 years to build and approximately 7 months to dismantle under legal compulsion. The board was reconstituted. Senior positions were eliminated. 2 independent directors were installed whose presence was partly symbolic and partly the enforceable condition under which the legitimate operations were permitted to continue at all. Ji-hwan resigned all formal positions in December. He did not hold a press conference. Michael Seo released 2 paragraphs that said the restructuring reflected necessary changes and that Ji-hwan wished the organization's legitimate operations continued success under new governance. 2 paragraphs. 15 years of empire, 2 paragraphs. He moved out of the waterfront estate in January. The movers came on a Tuesday morning, and he directed them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had reduced his material requirements to the point where the process took 4 hours rather than a day. He took the desk he'd worked at for 8 years. He took the books from the study actually read, most of them, a habit from before the organization became consuming enough to crowd out reading. He took the photograph of Jeju Island, which he had kept on his desk in the Har-Yun Pacific building through the entirety of the restructuring period. He moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of the city. The windows faced west. He noticed this the first evening, standing in the living room of a space that was adequate and quiet and carried none of the weight of everything the estate had been designed to announce. He thought about east-facing windows. He left the thought there. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in December. Courtroom was functional, rather than imposing the working room of a court that processed family matters with the efficient, unglamorous competence of an institution that understood endings as part of the ordinary rhythm of human life, rather than as occasions for drama. Amara arrived 10 minutes early. She sat with Christine on the left side and looked at the judge's bench and the court reporter's station and the institutional blankness of a room that had witnessed thousands of endings without absorbing any of them, and she felt a particular calm, not happiness, not relief, but the specific quiet of someone who has been preparing for a moment long enough that its arrival is experienced as completion rather than event. She had dressed deliberately, not in the way she used to dress for Ji-hwan's events, curated for his preferences, calibrated to reduce her visibility to a comfortable level, the clothing of a woman managing her presence in someone else's world. She had dressed for herself, a charcoal blazer she had bought in October because she liked the cut of it. Dark trousers, her own shoes, her own jewelry, her own choices from the bottom of the day to the top of it. Ji-hwan arrived at 9:58. He was with Michael Seo. He was wearing a dark suit, simpler than the aggressively tailored armor of his former life, the clothes of a man who no longer needed his appearance to project invulnerability. He looked different. He looked, she thought, like a person rather than a presentation. A sound before splitting. He sat on the right side without looking at her. The judge moved through the proceedings with the brisk practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was the 41st case this week. Standard questions in standard order. Voluntary agreement. Understanding of terms. Acknowledgement of finalization. Do you both enter this agreement voluntarily? Yes. Do you understand the terms as finalized? Yes. Do you acknowledge the finalization of this marriage? The judge signed. The court reporter made her notations. 37 minutes. 8 years and 37 minutes. In the corridor, outside the courtroom, the four of them performed the brief administrative courtesies of legal teams concluding a matter. Folders exchanged, documents confirmed, the professional nod of two attorneys who had managed a high-conflict matter and were now closing the file. Then Michael and Christine peeled away to exchange the final paperwork, leaving Ji-hwan and Amara standing in the corridor with 12 feet between them and the ambient sound of the courthouse moving around them on a Thursday morning. Ji-hwan looked at her. She looked at him. The corridor was not a dramatic space. It was fluorescent lit and linoleum floored and smelled faintly of the institutional coffee that courthouses always somehow smelled of, and it was full of other people moving to other places for other reasons. And it did not pause or clear or accommodate the specific weight of what was ending in it. Ji-hwan stood with his hands at his sides, and his face carrying something she had only seen in fragments over the past year in the conference room. In Michael's phone call, in the 7 federal sessions that his attorney had described to her in broad strokes through Christine. A sound like green wood splitting, the complete absence of performance, the face of a man who had finally, at the cost of everything he had built, learned how to simply be in a room without managing what the room thought of him. He nodded once. The nod was small and exact. It carried no apology. He had given that already in the conference room, and repeating it would have diminished it. Carried no plea. It was not the nod of a man asking for anything. It was the nod of a man who could finally see someone clearly and was acknowledging the act of seeing you are real. You were always real. I understand now that you were always more real than the version of you I decided on. Amara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the dinner. She thought about the tablecloth, and the wine glasses, and the 12 faces, and the particular quality of the room's silence when Ji-hwan had pointed at her and performed his certainty to the people who mattered most in his world. She thought about 20 minutes in a study she had visited enough times to know exactly where everything was. She thought about the drive across Seattle in the dark and the east-facing building, and the apartment that was already home before she moved in. She thought about all the miles between that night and this corridor. They were not clean miles. They were not the straightforward distance of a woman who walked out of a bad situation and into ease. They were miles that had moved through federal offices and legal sessions, and 6 weeks of sustained, difficult honesty and the specific, grinding courage of doing the right thing without an audience and without the certainty that it was going to turn out correctly. She had done it anyway. She nodded back. Same size. Same precision. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was longer and more private than a courthouse corridor could hold. Not warmth. Not the resumed intimacy of any version of what they had been. Just acknowledgement. The honest, unsentimental recognition that it had been real, that they had both been real inside it, and that it was over in the complete way that things are over when they are genuinely finished rather than merely paused. Christine appeared at her elbow with a folder and a question about the afternoon, and Amara turned, and the corridor became just a corridor with fluorescent lights and linoleum and institutional coffee smell, and she walked through it toward the exit without looking back. December air outside the courthouse was cold and carried the smell of recent rain. She stood on the steps for a moment. She breathed it in. She breathed it out. Then she walked to her car. January arrived. Amara spent the first week reorganizing her office. Not because it needed it. The space was already ordered in the way she kept everything functional, considered, without waste. But she wanted to. She wanted the specific, unremarkable pleasure of moving things because she could, of rearranging a space that answered entirely to her own preferences, of making choices that required no calculation beyond what she actually wanted. She moved the desk 4 inches to the left. She replaced the lamp, a brass thing she'd brought from storage, perfectly adequate, completely impersonal, with a slender matte-black fixtures she'd been looking at in a store window for 3 months and had been waiting, without consciously knowing she was waiting, for the right time to buy. A sound like green wood splitting. She took the photograph of Elliott Bay out of the drawer where it had been sitting since she'd moved in the first careful weeks when she'd been unsure she had the right to put permanent things on the walls, and she hung it beside the east-facing window at the height that made sense to her eye. She stepped back. She stood in the center of the room. She looked at the photograph, the lamp, the desk at its new position, the east-facing windows with their light that she had chosen specifically and that rewarded her every morning without being asked to. She stood there for a long moment without doing anything else. Then she sat down and opened her laptop. The Portland expansion approval came in the 3rd week of January. 4 staff, a client base she'd been cultivating for 6 months. Projections built on conservative assumptions, on actual capacity rather than optimistic ambition, on the principle she had learned over 4 years of building something real, that the structures that last are the ones built at the pace of genuine competence rather than the pace of desire. She thanked the board. She called Rachel. "Portland's approved," she said. Rachel's response was a short, emphatic sound that communicated more satisfaction than any sentence would have. Timeline: office is ready in 8 weeks. Staff in 6. We start the client conversations next month. I'll pull the onboarding documents. Pull the Portland-specific versions. The regulatory environment is slightly different. Already noted. This, Amara thought, was what a functional professional relationship felt like. You told someone something needed doing, and they had already anticipated half of it. You trusted the anticipation because it had been accurate consistently enough to earn the trust. The work proceeded on the merits of the work. She had not always known what that felt like. She knew now. She drove home along the waterfront route that evening. The water in January was gray-green and moving, and the late afternoon light was doing the low, complicated thing it did in winter, sitting at an angle that made the surface of the sound look lit from within rather than reflected from above. She had started taking this route in October, and she took it most evenings now because she liked the water on that sits inside, and she liked arriving home with the image of it still in her eyes. She pulled over at the small lot above the ferry terminal. She sat with the engine idling and the heater running and looked at the water. She thought about the dinner. Not with pain. That chapter of her response to it had closed somewhere in the legal sessions of November, ground down to something smaller and more settled by the sustained, unglamorous work of the preceding months. Sees. She thought about it with the particular quality of attention you bring to something that changed everything once you are far enough from it to see its full shape. She had pressed her hands flat against a white linen tablecloth. She had risen without hurrying. She had spent 20 minutes in a study where everything was already in place, because she had put it in place 3 months earlier, because she had understood not with drama, not with the sharp clarity of a specific moment of decision, but with the slow, certain accumulation of 8 years of small removals that she was going to need to be ready when the time came. She had been ready. She pulled back onto the road and drove home. The message from Ji-hwan arrived in June. Not a text, a letter, hand-delivered through Michael Seo's office to Christine's, which Christine forwarded to Amara with a single line that said, "From him. No action required." Amara opened it at her desk on a Friday afternoon, when the light was doing the long June thing it did, lasting past 9 in the Pacific Northwest, golden and faint, as if the day had decided it was worth staying in. The handwriting was his. She would have known it from across a room. 8 years of notes and cards and the specific pressure of a pen, held a certain way, had made it as recognizable to her as her own. The letter was not long. It said, "You never needed me. I needed you to need me. I understand the difference now. Took losing everything I built to understand it. And I know that probably tells you something about the kind of person I was. I don't expect this to matter to you. I'm not writing it because I expect anything from it. I'm writing it because it's true and because it seemed wrong to leave it unwritten. I hope the work is going well. From what I can see, it is. I think it always was." She read it once. She set it on the desk. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the east-facing windows where the June light was coming through at an angle that made the room feel different from other times of a day, warmer, more amber, the specific quality of late afternoon in a month when the days are generous. She felt many things. She did not try to name them all or arrange them into a clean summary of how she felt about a man who had taken 8 years of her life and used them primarily as evidence of his own worth. It was not clean. It was not simple. It was the complicated weight of something that had been real and damaging in equal measure, and the letter from the man who had caused the damage, and the specific absence of satisfaction she had once expected to feel when that acknowledgement finally arrived. She had expected satisfaction. What she felt was quieter and less defined than that something closer to the particular solemnity of standing at the end of something long and looking back at its full length and understanding, without drama or revelation, that it was genuinely over. She picked up the letter. She folded it. She put it in a folder on her desktop that she labeled with nothing but a date. Closed the folder. She looked at the east-facing windows for another moment. Then she opened the Portland expansion timeline and began marking action items for the following week. Park Sung-min called in April. She had not expected this. His voice on the phone was careful, slightly formal, the voice of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is executing it with precision, because the alternative improvisation, the risk of saying the wrong thing, felt like too much in a conversation this important. He said he understood she was not obligated to speak with him. He said he was calling because his attorney had been able to explain, in broad strokes, that the characterization of his role in the federal investigation had been more favorable than it might otherwise have been, and that the context providing that characterization had come from Ji-hwan's testimony, and that he had subsequently learned through sources he didn't name, and she didn't ask about, that she had also reviewed a list and made decisions about what she provided to investigators that had taken certain names into consideration. He stopped there. The specific stopping place of a man who has reached the edge of what he knows and is being honest about the edge. "I don't know exactly what you did," he said. "I know what my attorney told me. I know my situation is different from what it might have been." He paused. "My daughter is in her 2nd year. She wants to work on water systems in rural communities. She has a plan." She has his voice changed, the involuntary register shift of a person speaking about someone they love with the specific unguarded warmth that love produces. She's very specific. She gets it from her mother. Amara held the phone and looked at the photograph of Elliot Bay on her wall. I wanted to say thank you, Park said, directly. Not through intermediaries. It deserved to be said by me to you. I didn't do it for him, she said. I know. I did it because it was the right thing. I know that too. A pause that carried the weight of a man choosing his words with care. Doesn't make me less grateful. She sat with that for a moment. How are you, she said, a short exhale. Rebuilding. The word restructuring doesn't quite capture what the year has been. But I'm still here. My family is intact. My daughter is in school on a path she chose for herself. He paused. That's enough for right now. That's a great deal, she said. Yes. Another pause. And you? She looked around her office. The desk 4 inches to the left. The lamp she'd chosen. The photograph on the wall. The Portland timeline on her screen, and Rachel's calendar invitation in her inbox, and the sound of her team in the adjacent room. Building, she said. Good. And the word carried genuine warmth, not the performative warmth of social obligation, but the real warmth of a person who means what he says. Good. They ended the call with the quiet, mutual recognition of two people who have both survived something significant and who understand, without needing to discuss it, that the survival itself is worth acknowledging just once. Directly, and then left to stand as its own fact. Portland office opened in May. Amara drove down for the first day and stood in the space her team had spent 6 weeks preparing modest, functional, exactly the right size for 4 people growing into work they were good at. She looked at the windows on the south side that let in a different quality of light than Seattle, and the desk arrangements her project manager had coordinated, and the small plant Rachel had suggested for the entrance in the same practical, non-sentimental way that Rachel suggested most things. She shook hands with the Portland team. She sat in on their first client meeting. She drove back to Seattle that evening and felt, somewhere on the I-5 between cities, a specific feeling of something expanding correctly, not beyond its capacity. Not at the pace of ambition outrunning infrastructure, but at the pace of genuine readiness. Pace of something that has been built on actual ground. She had learned that ground required time. She had had 4 years of 3 in the morning to understand it. In June, a few weeks after the letter, Amara was invited to speak at the Cascade Supply Chain Forum, the same event she had attended in the early weeks after the separation, when she had appeared as Veyne Meridian Advisory for the first time and worked a room for herself rather than for someone else. She was invited not as a guest, but as a featured speaker. The topic they requested was logistics strategy in uncertain markets, which was genuinely her area and which she could address for 20 minutes without preparation, though she spent 3 hours preparing because she did things thoroughly, and the thoroughness was as much a part of her as the competence it served. She arrived early. She stood backstage for a few minutes before her slot, in the specific quiet of a person who is about to walk into a room full of people and say something they mean, and she felt not nerves exactly, but the alert, alive quality that competence and genuine stakes produced together. She walked out. The room was full. She recognized a few faces, Karen Hollis in the 3rd row, who had been her first conversation at this same event a year earlier and had become, over the following months, a client and something adjacent to a professional friend. The supply chain director from Portland, whose firm she had begun advising in February. Several faces she knew from the network that had been growing quietly for 4 years and openly for 1. She looked at the room. The room looked back. She began. She spoke for 22 minutes about logistics strategy in uncertain markets, and what she said was specific and grounded and useful in the practical, applicable way that expertise is useful when it comes from actual work rather than theoretical understanding. She did not use abstractions where specifics would serve. She did not hedge where she had a clear position. She did not minimize her conclusions, or soften her recommendations, or perform uncertainty she did not feel. She spoke like someone who knew what she was talking about, and had decided that knowing it was enough. When she finished, the applause was genuine in the way you can tell. Applause is genuine, a particular quality of it, immediate and sustained. Karen Hollis caught her eye from the third row and gave a small, deliberate nod that communicated more than applause could. Amara thanked the room. She stepped back from the podium. That evening, she drove home along the waterfront. The light in June stayed past 9 and she was in no hurry. A sound like green wood split. She pulled over at the small lot above the ferry terminal and sat with the engine idling and looked at the water the way she had been looking at it for months, with the unhurried attention of someone who has time for the thing in front of them. She thought about the dinner. She thought about Ji-hwan pointing at her across the table and building a performance from her silence. Silence. She thought about the specific quality of events 8 years deep, containing multitudes, carrying the patience of a woman who was still deciding when to use what she had been building. She had been building a third option. Not flight, not submission. A third thing entirely. The slow, methodical construction of a life that could stand on its own ground, in her own name, without any structure that required his certainty to hold it up. She had built it in the dark. She had brought it into the light. She pulled back onto the road. She drove home. She parked in the building's underground garage and took the elevator to her floor and let herself into the apartment that was, simply and completely, home. She set her bag down. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, drinking it with the unceremonious ease of someone in a space that asks nothing of them but their presence. She walked to the green, to the east-facing windows. The June evening was doing what June evenings in Teal do when they are being generous, holding the last of the light past any reasonable hour. Gold going to amber, going to the specific blue-gray of a Pacific Northwest dusk that doesn't fully arrive until long after you've expected it. She stood at the window. She did not think about Ji-hwan. She did not think about the dinner, or the tablecloth, or the federal offices, or the corridor outside the courtroom. Sips. She thought about the Portland team in their first client meeting and the particular quality of a room where people are doing work they are good at. She thought about Karen Hollis's nod from the third row. She thought about Rachel, who had already drafted the Q3 expansion analysis and would have it in Amara's inbox by morning because Rachel was the kind of person who did things before they were asked for and did them correctly. She thought about the lamp she had chosen, and the desk she had moved, and the photograph on the wall, and the folder on her desktop, labeled with nothing but a date. She thought about all the things that were hers, earned and chosen and built and defended and kept. Outside, the light held for another hour patient, unglamorous, doing what it had always done, without reference to who was watching or what they had survived to reach the window. It was just light. Real, continuous, and entire indifferent to the stories of the people it fell on. Amara stood in it. She stood in it for as long as she wanted. Then she turned away from the window and went to make dinner in her own kitchen, in her own time, in the quiet and sufficient life she had built from the ground up, one invisible piece at a time, long before anyone else had understood what she was doing,